My name is Sarah Carr, and I'm coordinator for the Coastal Marine Ecosystem-Based Management Tools Network, which is a service of Octo. And we're very pleased to have you here today to talk about financing coral reef conservation with tourism-related tools. And we have David Myers of the Conservation Finance Alliance on to speak about that. I also wanted to let you know who everyone else is. We also have Ray Evrard, who is co-hosting also with Octo, and we have Sherry Wagner, who is representing the Reef Resilience Network, which is co-hosting this webinar as well. And we wanted to let you know that this webinar is sponsored by ICRI. ICRI stands for the International Coral Reef Initiative, and it's an informal partnership which strives to preserve coral reefs and related ecosystems around the world. They're sponsoring today's webinars as part of its collaboration with Conservation Finance Alliance for promoting innovative financing for coral reef conservation. Just a couple other tidbits as we get started. So for the format of the webinar, we'll have a presentation by David, and then we'll have time for questions afterwards. You can ask the questions by typing the questions into the Q&A panel or the chat panel of your user interfaces, so we can, and then we'll relay the questions to David. In addition, if there's questions that we aren't able to get to, there's going to be a discussion forum on the Reef Resilience Network forum, and information about how to join that is going to be posted at the end of the webinar. So the continued discussion on another forum. And just to let you know, there'll be an additional coral reef financing webinar on October 2nd and 3rd. It'll cover conservation trust funds and public-private partnerships. And we'll send out information about that webinar to you all in the few weeks when we've finalized all the details. So anyway, it was a long intro, and I'll turn it over to David now.
All right, thank you, Sarah. Again, my name is David Myers. I'm the Executive Director of the Conservation Finance Alliance, which is a global network for conservation finance practitioners and experts. And I'll show a slide at the end to, if you want to join the network, please do. I apologize if the internet connection is not so good as we go forward, but hopefully it'll be stable enough for the presentation. So I'm going to talk to you today about financing coral reef conservation and management with tourism-related tools. And this is part of a series of presentations that we've been giving, and look forward to the questions afterwards. So I'm going to start with some introductory issues, main issues, talk a little bit about site planning and tourism planning, and then I'll cover a few different tools in detail: site entry and activity fees, and tourism concessions. Those are the main focus of the presentation. Then I'll talk a little bit about different governance approaches, public-private partnerships, tourism taxes, volunteerism, and philanthropy. So some of the main issues, coral reefs, as everyone knows, are under severe threat. Global warming, pollution, overfishing, and all the local impacts on coral reefs make them less resilient in the face of climate change. And in most cases, almost all cases, there's insufficient funding to meet the conservation management needs. When you look at the different financing tools, there's quite an array of them. New ones are emerging all the time, and it may seem quite overwhelming. Often local or national capacity is quite limited for implementing these tools. What would be useful is a process or a framework for evaluating options and for understanding some of these tools in more depth. And so this presentation really will focus on some of the tried and true tools which are related to tourism. Some of this work is built on a report that was done at the end of last year and is available on the Conservation Finance Alliance website, called Finance Tools for Coral Reef Conservation. I highly recommend downloading that report. It's kind of a working guide on some of these finance tools. It does go into some of the more innovative tools. We gave a presentation on this a few months ago, which you could get access to on the site. And it's really a good resource. So I highly recommend that. And in that presentation, in that document, we covered a whole range of different finance tools, including those with quite high ease of implementation, such as donations, philanthropy, government finance, which is really important, some of the tourism-related tools, and then some of the more medium and more complicated tools like bonds and biodiversity offsets and everything provided on the list here. Just as a reminder of where protected areas' own revenues or site-based revenues fall within the sources of financing. This comes from a not a comprehensive OECD report, but at least quick analysis replicates what we see in a lot of terrestrial protected areas, is that government funds form a large percentage of finance for protected areas, for example. These are for NPAs. So between government funds and donors, was the majority of financing, and own revenues came in at about 17%. So a lot of the revenues I'm talking about today are only part of your finance mix for your specific site for a coral reef. However, there are some marine protected areas that are able to practically self-finance through tourism-related fees because they're such high levels of tourism. So now, there's a lot of benefits of tourism for conservation. There's a lot of challenges as well, but some of the benefits include building a constituency of support for the conservation of nature and culture through private sector and other partnerships, actively contributing to conservation through involving visitors in both management tasks and also direct contributions. It helps justify political support and better funding for management by recognizing the importance of nature and tourism for both local and national economies. And if it's done well, you can ameliorate the tourism impacts through good planning, and damage and others. There's also a chance to enhance social and cultural benefits by providing interpretive services and educational opportunities, which is becoming more and more important as people are more and more removed from nature. And it helps communities near the conservation site understand and better tolerate management approaches, as well as stimulating local economic linkages. Some of the feasibility issues that should be considered are the following. You want tourism to have the potential to provide a net positive impact on the site management. And now in certain cases, the tourism pressure could be so high that the site's so fragile that tourism is not an ideal source of revenue. This is specifically an issue around coral reefs. If you don't manage the impacts well, the entire conservation value you're trying to protect could be lost. Also, you want to make sure revenues are greater than costs. This makes perfect sense, but I mean, you want to include all of the costs, infrastructure, trying to manage the risks and impacts and things like that. Demand is such a huge issue, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but it's whether there's tourism, demand is dependent on site location, various aspects of attractiveness, accessibility, proximity to other tourist destinations, the quality of your marketing campaign, issues such as national security, political stability, things like that, and whether there's existing local tourism business infrastructure, hotels, things like that. So all these need to be considered, as well as the issue of whether the managers and staff have sufficient capacity to set, collect, and retain the fees for tourism. The legal and administrative framework also must allow the site to generate the revenue and to retain revenue. Oftentimes, revenue from tourism will go back to central treasury. That's often returned back to protected areas through government support and budgetization, but it's really important to make sure that money goes through back to managing. So some of the challenges and safeguards can be grouped into managing the revenues for conservation, making sure that those revenues go back, and of course managing tourism to minimize the negative impacts. So there are, in terms of methodology of this is quite general, to try to understand, and develop tourism in a site that, for example, doesn't have it, or where you want to expand it. You start with a scoping phase to just see if this is the right thing. Then if you want to move forward, you do a detailed feasibility study. Then there's the design phase, where you plan out all of your interventions. Then, of course, implementation phase, and then you want to do monitoring, evaluation, and adaptive management as you go forward. The site should have 2 plans in place, at least. A management plan, which lays out the overall management goals, involves all the scientific elements and things like that to achieve the goals of the site. And then a business plan is highly recommended as well. That explores your revenue options, looks at the development costs for implementing the tourism and the management plan, usually over a 5 to 10 year period. That should include all of your costs, salary, equipment, things like that, including some marketing expenses. So you may also want to include a site tourism plan, although that could easily be part of the business plan or the management plan. And for tourism planning, you want to look at what are your tourist assets? What are the current national and local tourism circuits? What are your infrastructure needs and availability? Who are your key stakeholders? What are the social and economic values and beneficiaries of those values? This often helps identifying the key stakeholders and partners. What are your management needs and capacity? Of course, your financial needs, and especially startup financial resources. So it may look like it makes sense from an ongoing basis, but you're going to make sure you need to make sure that you have adequate startup financial resources to start. We highly recommend business planning for coral reefs and associated protected areas. A business plan, it's a document that is developed through consultation and analysis. The process of developing that document is almost as important as the document itself, by engaging key stakeholders and building commitment and engagement throughout the process. It'll summarize the entity's plan to achieve their objectives for both sound management and financing, and it can be written for different organization types: protected area, NGOs, community-based organizations, conservation trust funds, or of course businesses, which is where the business plans originated. And it's in a style that could attract investors or donors, and so that's the goal. Here's an outline of a business plan. We covered this a little bit in the previous presentation, so if you want to get more information on that, either download the guide or go back to the previous presentation, but just give you an idea of what a business plan would look like. Okay, so now we're going to go into some of these specific finance solutions or mechanisms. And just as a background, when you're looking at any kind of finance mechanism or solution, you want to include all the different elements of it, and it can include multiple instruments. So you often have, in many cases, a finance source, someone who's the source of the payment. In the case of tourism, often it's the tourists themselves. And then you have different instruments that could pass through an intermediary, or could pass directly to beneficiary or recipient. For example, if the beneficiary or recipient is the site manager, just an entrance fee might go straight to that site manager. Intermediary could be a concessionaire or a tourist operator, things like that. And then the beneficiary recipient will take certain actions that will result in the conservation outcomes that you're seeking. And then there's a loop back with monitoring and evaluation. So that's the basic structure, and we'll just cover that in a few of these different solutions. So some of the basic tourism finance solutions include entrance fees. These are fees charged to tourists for access to or use of facilities inside a protected area or a natural site of interest. Activity fees, which we consider separate from entrance fees. These are charged to tourists to participate in a recreational activity in a protected area or natural site. It could include scuba diving, snorkeling, camping. So these are in addition to entrance fees. And then there's other types of park-based fees, licenses, special use fees for, say, filming, things like that, that go beyond just sort of standard activities, and could include accommodation, sale of products, things like that. And then we'll talk in some detail about concessions. which are the right granted by government, a company, or the controlling body of the site to undertake tourism-related operation in a protected area or natural site, usually in exchange for a fee. And there's two types of concessions. We'll cover both commercial concessions and management concessions. And then visitor taxes, which differ from fees in that they're applied more generally. Oftentimes the money goes straight to government treasury and are not necessarily tied to specific services. And finally, we'll just talk very briefly about volunteering and donations from tourists and how you could capture some of that revenue. So starting with entry and activity fees, as I mentioned before, the finance source is going to be the tourist, but it could also be the tour operators themselves. They're going to pay an entrance or an activity fee to, say, park management. Could be a conservation trust fund as well, or government, which then either through grants or directly will finance park management actions, which result in hopefully ecological integrity, but also it's important to note tourist satisfaction is one of the goals. And then through tracking the impact of the actions, tourist satisfaction is a really great way to promote sites. So when a tourist has an excellent experience, they will rapidly share that on social media, and word of mouth marketing is really important for tourism development. Now, fees can have multiple objectives, and it's important to balance the income generation with public access to a public good. Coral reefs and protected areas are public goods. They're important for a range of benefits. And so you want to design your fee system with the multiple objectives in mind. Tiered fees, for example, are used where you can create low-cost fees for, say, local school children, or maybe charge, in some cases, they charge international visitors more than local visitors because you want to encourage local visitation to build up interest and commitment towards those sites. And then, some people that use the site more often, maybe you want to provide ease of access to those sites, again, to just maintain good relations with communities, things like that. In the case of coral reefs, there's a strong impetus to come up with different structures for fishing communities and local communities for access to the different sites. You want to balance you can use fees to balance the visitor numbers with impact on ecosystem. This is not a straightforward approach, but in general, you can understand that if you raise the fees, you're going to discourage certain types of users from coming in. And in many cases, you could have an exclusive site by having very high fees. But the reaction of visitors to changes in fee levels is going to depend on what's called price elasticity, or the elasticity of demand. And this is an economic term that refers to how much change in price is going to influence the number of people that want to spend the money to come. So that has to be analyzed along with the comparing alternatives for different sites. If you raise the price too high, people will go to a different site, and so you'll lose money. You also want to make sure that you're collecting enough fees to maintain the system that collects the fees and to maintain or build the infrastructure that you need to manage the site. So here are some general practice standards for entrance and activity fees. As I mentioned before, the fee system should be part of a robust protected area or site management plan. The fee pricing should be based on a systematic financial assessment. As I mentioned, both the costs, are you satisfying the costs? Is it a profitable approach? But also what's the impact on all the social and ecological missions of the site? Targeting marketing campaigns, they can help attract regular flow of visitors. Think about facilitating local ownership of the system and the revenues collected. And this can be reviewed every 2 years. Institutional capacity to manage effectively the site and the fee system should be established early on. Strong communication strategy will help build acceptance among the local communities, making sure they understand why the tourists are coming, the fact that they're paying money, where that money goes, so the retention of revenues by protected area agencies provides really important management incentives, but also local incentives and participation in planning and management can be reinforced by community revenue sharing agreements and things like that. And also it's important, as I mentioned earlier, to recognize that revenue from entrance fees are part of a diverse portfolio for revenue sources, and you should not rely only on one type of revenue source, but try to have a diverse mix of different sources. Now I'd like to move to tourism concessions. So this is I think people are quite familiar with concessions, but it's where, again, the original finance source is the tourist or tour operators or the concession, that bring the tourists into the site. The concessionaire provides tourism services and collects money from the tourists. In exchange for those services, they pay often a concession fee to park management or to government or whoever is owning the site or controlling the site. And then the park management or whoever is actually operating the site will take certain activities, again, seeking ecological quality and tourist satisfaction. And the economic model I didn't mention before for the entrance fees is this very similar, where the user pays for these recreational services, but also for concessions, you can get efficiency through outsourcing. In some cases, a for-profit or a non-profit entity could be more efficient than a government entity at managing the site. And so there's a cost savings or an efficiency there that is very important and should be considered as an objective. There's two types of tourism concessions in general, although there's a bit of overlap between the two. Commercial concessions and management concessions. And for commercial concessions, a concessionaire pays a fee for the right to undertake a specific commercial operation in a protected area in accordance with the user pays principle. So these could be diving sites, guided tours, snorkeling, restaurants, a range of different services that are provided for tourists within a site or a protected area. Otherwise, there's also management concessions, which is where a concessioning authority outsources responsibility for management and conservation of a protected area or other natural site to a concessionaire with greater capacity, more efficiency, things like that. This is usually in the form of public and private partnerships. And there's different kinds of concession models. I'm going to go quite quickly through these different ones. There's some overlap, but as you'll see, it's important to kind of understand what the differences are and plan your concession strategy based on the appropriate model. So in general, a concession is where a concessionaire pays a fee for the rights, often over a long term, to design, build, and manage tourism facilities. So accommodations, restaurants, shops, here, often the concessionaire takes responsibility for all the initial investment and the ongoing management. There's some examples of terrestrial places, but also a lot of hotels on remote islands, things like that. For example, the Tanzania Chumbi protected area is like a private hotel, but also taking full responsibility for management of the site. So that's a combination of both a management concession and a commercial concession. A lease type agreement is where a concessionaire pays a rental fee to lease land, and this is maybe for a medium or shorter term, and with existing facilities. This could be the case for in many cases, there's telecommunication infrastructure, but also where there's an existing hotel and accommodation, restaurant, and things like that, where the concessionaire will come in and lease the operation, assume full operating responsibility, and usually the concessioning authority retains the full responsibility for the capital expenditures and maintenance of the site. Permits are more temporary. They could be up to 10 years. And this gives access to the concessionaire to do certain activities, guided walking, canoeing, diving, things like that on site in exchange for a fee. And the tourism examples for PIPA, for example, on the Phoenix Islands, the Phoenix Island protected area in Kiribati. Then licenses, they give access to certain privileges that without that authorization would constitute a legal act. So, for example, license to do sport fishing, or in some cases take a dive boat to a certain area, requires due diligence from the competent authority. And the example here is there's, tour vessels in Galapagos National Park. And then finally, management contract. These are more where the concessionaire enters into a long-term agreement to manage the land or existing facilities. It could include responsibility for both operations and maintenance. The concessioning authority often remains responsible for all investments. Leaves rather than pays a fee. So this could be a site where they have the services that they want to, and so they actually subcontract out the management of different facilities to allow, in this case for Bonaire, for example, enforcement, education, maintenance, and research. And then finally, service agreement, where concessionaire receives the right to manage protected area, usually responsible for all the investments and main operational expenditures. However, the concessionaire here is often granted the right to collect entrance and activity fees, which they can then use to finance the conservation activities. And the example given here is a public-private partnership with the government of the Dominican Republic for co-management of a large protected area in DR. I'll go into a little bit more detail here is with an NGO called New Finance, which is using the shared governance for marine ecosystems, and they are working in different areas. And the model is the following: that the government creates an agreement with an NGO or a special purpose entity that could be created, which could be a partnership from different organizations, NGO, private sector, often engaging local stakeholders and having a very specific responsibility to the government to take care of certain management activities. Those activities then are implemented for the protected area. In this case, through a co-management committee that oversees these activities that involves both government, civil society, private sector partners, putting in place annual work plans, monitoring and financial reviews. And then the protected area is managed through these actions with the goal of improving ecosystems, enhancing community livelihoods, assuring marine spatial planning is taking place, and good zonation monitoring, and of course support to tourism activities. And the government oversees whether or not this consortium is implementing the management agreement correctly. So you have this shared governance type of approach where in this case, it's a 10-year renewable agreement. There's annual work plans. The NGO is covering all these costs of equipment, operations, and personnel. In some cases, there's an annual fee paid back to the government, but there's the rights, as I mentioned, to charge these user fees, which is how the system is functioning. For the government, this is really great because they can have a well-managed site with a very little additional cost. They don't have to bring on public debt. They don't have to allocate public budget, things like that. They also are not transferring the property to a private entity, but they're just providing a concession, a management concession. And of course, the MPA, if it's well managed through this approach, is in better shape. And so there are so many sites that this could work for, but it does require a long, complicated process to build awareness and build commitment and collaboration with the different entities involved. In the case of Blue Finance, they work with impact investors to provide the initial funding for the site. And as I mentioned, they're working in Dominican Republic, but also other sites in the Caribbean and Southeast Asia. 9 countries or more have projects in process, in preparation. So there are standard practices, again, for concessions. I'm going to just go through these very quickly. To make, the first is really important. You make sure you put conservation first, and note that not all areas are suitable for tourism and should not be turned over, used for concessions. You want to value and make sure you maximize the wider benefits of tourism, job creation, local revenue, obviously striving to make tourism sustainable from the beginning through the end, important engagement of local communities, making sure that there's market viability early on to ensure that the operations are sustainable and profitable. Of course, developing stakeholder awareness and strong engagement from the beginning and maintaining that throughout is essential through your communication strategy. Assure that you have a sound concessions framework that includes all the legal and regulatory structures in place. Oftentimes, they're not in place at the beginning, so it's important to establish them. Rely on robust site management plans, selecting the appropriate concession model, as I mentioned, as we went through those models. Transparent and clear procurement procedures to make sure that the deal is balanced, that the investor is qualified, and that the organization that's implementing the site is viable and sustainable. Equitable contracts that protect the interest of both parties. In the case where a contract is too favorable to one party, often that results in challenges later on. Managing the contracts well, and establishing risk management by identifying and monitoring those risks throughout the whole stakeholder engagement, site assessments, regular reporting, and ongoing monitoring. And then, of course, monitoring and evaluate the progress to continually learn and improve the management of the site. Okay, I'm going to just cover a few things now quite quickly, and then we'll get to some questions and answers. The first is governance types. So these are different IUCN governance types. A is, of course, standard, where government manages a site. B is kind of shared governance. C is private governance, where individuals, a nonprofit or a for-profit organization take over the site. And D is governance by indigenous peoples and local communities. And so one of the first steps is trying to identify what's the most efficient governance type for the site. By choosing the appropriate approach, you can improve cost effectiveness and efficiency, allocating to the private sector activities that the private sector does best. And in many cases, directly reducing the cost of management. So, or reducing poaching by engaging the communities, for example, in management of the site. The next area here is tourism taxes. And taxes, as I mentioned earlier in the introduction, are fees that tend to not be associated with direct services. They tend to go straight to government treasury, and then are allocated or distributed afterwards. Examples are airport taxes, departure taxes, hotel bed taxes often go to tourist agencies, but there are opportunities for some money going back to conservation or cruise or airline tickets. So a lot of times taxes tend to be invisible. If you can tag them onto an airport ticket, then people don't necessarily see them. They're often collected through private businesses and then remitted to government. So in some cases, taxes, for example, Belize, there's a tax upon entry that goes to a conservation trust fund that helps finance protected areas. As well, in Palau, there's a type of system as well where money is going to finance conservation. So there's definitely opportunities there. And the last approach I'll mention is volunteering. This is a growing area, also called voluntourism, where you can get volunteers to come in and assist with protected area management, research, coral reef monitoring, for example. This is a combination of volunteers providing direct financing to a site and also donating their time. It really can help promote the site. It's something that is useful for areas of that are quite remote or undeveloped. If you can get tourists to come out and volunteer, that builds the knowledge of the site. It helps you develop the different tourist opportunities. For example, for coral reefs, it helps you identify where ideal dive sites are that are good for development and where you should try to keep boats away, for example. And it can cultivate, local support and commitment to conservation. So you'll get a copy of this presentation in PDF format that'll be available for download. So I've included a whole range of additional resources that you can look up here. These are some of them quite comprehensive reports in addition to the guide that I mentioned early on. And with that, I'm going to end and we'll open it up to questions, but I just wanted to give a shout out to the Conservation Finance Alliance, my organization, where you can get Conservation Finance news, become a CFA member, sign up for the newsletter. And I want to thank all of our partners here, which you can see down below. And back over to you, Sarah.
Okay, thank you, David. Sherry, did you want to unmute and talk about the discussion forum?
Yeah, should we do that now before the questions?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. This is Sherry Wagner. I'm the program coordinator for the Reef Resilience Network, which is a global network of managers, practitioners, and experts. And hopefully some of you on today are part of the network. After the webinar, we will post questions if there's some that we don't get a chance to get to with our allotted time today. We'll post them in the forum, and we encourage you to go register. You'll get an email when your account has been approved if you haven't signed up already. And then on the main forum, you'll see a discussion thread for this webinar. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Sherry. David, we'll start with this question. To what extent does tying conservation funding to the success of the tourism economy encourage behaviors or developments, such as airport or hospitality infrastructure, that might impact local and global coral reef health?
Right, that's a great question. It's something that needs to be managed actively. And so in your, scoping and feasibility, it's important to try to identify what the different sites, tourist sites are likely to be. Oftentimes they evolve naturally. People like find places, and you want to try to identify them and control access as best you can, so that you don't have too many tourists coming, and that you can control those access, control the numbers. But some sites are just, too fragile. And the way that some tourism sites have developed, you do get, this mass tourism, which puts a huge strain on it. And so you need to work with government regulatory agencies, need to work with the tourist associations. It's in some places they've tried to have, high fees to make it exclusive hotels. But when the tourism demand is so high, and it's really growing a lot in Asia, especially, you have a real challenge managing these sites. For example, Thailand just made put off limits one of their big beach sites in Phi Phi Islands near Phuket, and I don't know if people saw a picture, but there's like so many boats coming to visit Phi Phi Island and all these different sites. It's really hard to manage it. And where certain sites are excluded, people find other sites. So it's really important to have a master plan for tourism, to work with all the different agencies and the tourism operators to try to maintain these sites, because if they're overused and damaged, you lose so much value. But I agree, this is a huge challenge and something that really needs to be done in partnership and collaboration.
Okay, thank you, David. We had another question. Someone was wondering about the applicability of the techniques you discussed to coral reef conservation in general, including restoration, reduction of land-based sources of pollution, and more, as opposed to just coral reefs that are in MPAs, since that's a small fraction. Well, I don't know the exact size, but a fraction of coral reefs worldwide.
Yeah, there are so many threats to coral reefs, and tourism as a revenue generating mechanism can only provide benefit to certain of those threats. You need to look at the site in an integrated manner, and there's so many other tools that conservation finance can provide to try to, say, reduce agricultural runoff by producing oftentimes subsidized fertilizers and things like that, that tourism have nothing to do with. But the one thing it can do is, if you have tourism and can show the economic benefits of tourism, then you can convince government and other stakeholders that the health of the coral reef is really important. But again, tourism is only one type, one sort of category of tools that help finance coral reefs and help manage them. But there's other threats that will need other finance solutions to address. I'm sure that was not a complete answer, but as I say, that can be quite complicated. There are a lot of other tools.
Okay. All right. Thank you, David. We're getting really good conversation and lots of great questions. So I'm trying to, we won't be able to hit them all, but we can get to a number of them. There was a question as, are there any countries, or what countries are best for these kinds of conservation ecotourism approaches? Are some better than others, or what sort of conditions do you need?
Yeah, I've not seen a kind of review of different countries' approaches. So I really, don't want to name names at this point based on limited information. But where tourism tends to work the best, you have strong governance. This is such a prerequisite for many conservation finance tools, and obviously Costa Rica is always cited as a great destination, well-managed ecotourism, things like that. But basically, good governance, the rule of law, contracts being respected, and things like that are essential. In places where that's not the case, you do have the risk of private interests or mass tourism just coming in and dominating and destroying areas. So, but if anyone has knows of a study that's looked at that, I'd be very interested in seeing that.
Okay. All right. Thank you, David. There was a question about how does Conservation Finance Alliance work with groups, or what are the mechanisms for that?
We're an awareness raising, capacity development, and innovation organization. We try to encourage knowledge sharing and information on conservation finance tools. We are open to working with groups, so just reach out and let us know. We don't have budgets to come in and do training, but we're trying to establish that.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, another question. So many. Okay, can you mention any successful examples of how licenses for fishers have been used in MPA management financing? I assume this raised questions about the scale of the fishery, how to secure access, and gear regulation.
Well, so of course, marine protected areas and different sites are almost entirely multiple use areas, and so they always include, almost always include access to certain fisheries resources with limitations on equipment and area access and things like that. So that doesn't fall into the tourism area, but just in general, general site management. But in terms of tourism, you do get fish licenses from sports fishing, and that can provide a really strong revenue generating resource. When you have sites, Costa Rica's got a very strong sport fishing license industry. Other countries are starting to develop that. It's they're all almost entirely catch and release for certain species, but yeah, there's great opportunity there, and in many places this is not monitored, not really, no revenues are captured. So it's a great opportunity.
Okay. All right. Thank you, David. Another question, what tools can be used to value entrance and activity fees for tourists? For example, would it be willingness to pay surveys, or how do you set those?
Right. This is a great question. And my colleagues at the Conservation Strategy Fund would say, absolutely, willingness to pay is essential. It is where you have some money to do a willingness to pay study. This is often very enlightening, but what in practical terms, oftentimes you'll get figures for willingness to pay much higher than what you'd expect, and often because people don't actually have to put the money out, they're more likely to say that they're willing to pay more than they're actually willing to pay. So for us, the best practice is to compare alternative sites, choose an amount that seems reasonable given the local economy, making sure that, again, that you're covering your costs, and then track the impact. If you're going to double the price, you want to make sure you're tracking the number of visitors before and after, things like that, to see what the impact is. So many cases, if people traveling long distances, they're going to be relatively price insensitive for an entrance fee, and so it's possible that you could raise the price. But remember, tourists want to see the value for what they're paying. So even if a diving fee is $4, which is could be rather low, because each tank dive is costs about $60. In general, if they're going down, if anchor damage to the site, you will get dissatisfied clients, and of course people share their dissatisfaction quite rapidly. So really, it's important to make sure that the quality of the experience and service matches the price for what you're getting.
Okay, thanks, David. There's a question. So this is about arrival and departure taxes. The person that's been, this questioner has been told that this is a non-starter in some U.S. jurisdictions due to legal issues at airports. Is that a real thing or just naysayer verbiage?
Oh, that I don't know. So when you buy an airplane ticket, you got all kinds of taxes. I don't know if people remember, but it used to be charged departure taxes and things like that when you left countries and things like that. It was always a hassle, and so they've put all those taxes onto the airline tickets, so you don't really see them. But I am sure that there are numerous regulations around what can go on an airline ticket, and I'm not familiar with if there's special rules in the U.S., but that's definitely part of your scoping analysis. You would want to look into that.
Okay. Okay, thank you, David. The question, what mechanisms do you suggest for situations where tourism fees in all forms are not enough to cover the costs? Blended finance? And what are the best controls to avoid locking in tourism numbers to cover the costs?
Right, so there was a question earlier to try to, sorry about that wind, hopefully it's not too bad. There was a question earlier about trying to make sure that tourism is not, like making revenue from tourism is not causing too many tourists to come just to make revenue to cover the cost of the protected area or the site. This is really important. The most common sourcing for protected areas, for example, it comes from governments. So governments provide through budgeting to protected areas agencies annual operating costs, and improving how you manage those budgets, improving how you're asking for money, and lobbying to make sure you get enough money is one great way to do that. Obviously, donor financing, cultivating relationships with multilateral or bilateral international donors. Now, blended finance. Yeah, and I did not mention. I did want to mention that there's an emerging tools of green bonds, and in this case, blue bonds, are really worth looking into for tourism development. The problem is bonds tend to be large scale, and you would need to say finance an entire country's protected area, tourism infrastructure in protected areas with a bond. But that's definitely an interesting possibility that should be explored. Otherwise, there are impact investors that are looking to make positive investments in nature, and these could be everything from angel investors and local investors, real estate people, to some of the larger funds like Mirova and others who are looking for opportunities to invest in projects that provide a financial return as well as an impact for the environment, a positive impact for the environment. And blended finance, the term is a great one, and something that where you combine grants and investment, and this is something worth exploring for sure.
Okay, thank you, David.
I'm trying to be relatively quick. I know this is quite a number of answers, quite a number of questions.
A question, you may have sort of already gotten to this, but which finance tools would be best to fund restoration of corals before perhaps funding can be sought from tourists?
Yeah, so that was, that I did skip over that. Someone asked that earlier. Coral restoration, from my understanding, the most common way to fund that is through grants. There is, and then there's of course, as I mentioned before, volunteerism. There's a great opportunity to get people to contribute their time. They feel like they're really doing something. You can combine restoration with learning to dive, things like that, or taking dive courses. There's a very innovative approach that's being developed around insurance, and this is in Quintana Roo, Mexico. They're working with, this is TNC that's working with hotel owners and looking at, and working with the insurance company, I believe it's Swiss Re Reinsurance, and I've identified ways to encourage restoration and finance restoration through different insurance products. Because a resilient reef protects the hotels from storm damage, for example. And so there's emerging opportunities there. It's still early stage to know whether that's going to be successful or not, but it's worth keeping an eye on.
Okay, great. Thank you, David. And can you flip back to your previous slide about your report?
Okay, yeah, sure. Your report, the guide. The
guide, yeah, sorry.
Early on?
Yeah. There was a question of where someone could find examples of success cases where they could see the methodology used, et cetera. So I just wanted to make sure everyone had the link for this, or knew about this. Are there any other resources that you would suggest?
Yeah, I would. Melissa Walsh at the Pacific Ocean Finance Program has put together a very interesting list of existing finance solutions and some links to them. So there are different case studies, and that can be found if you just Google Pacific Ocean Finance Program and look for. There's a catalog of finance tools that comes from the Biodiversity Finance Initiative, BioFin, that Melissa has on the site there. But there's also a list. I'm not sure what it's under, but if someone can look that up. It's not obvious, but there's a really great list there, and it's worth looking at. And it has really good examples, and a lot of it's around the Pacific. So a lot of it pertains to coral reefs.
Okay, thank you. And we got a sort of similar question from two different people, and so I think that'll be our last question. But so one is, what tools? I'll read them both to you, and there's some. They're not quite the same question, but what tools work best in areas with a well-established tourism economy that already have a large MPA like the Florida Keys? Are there examples of shifting an existing economy to better support an MPA? And then there was also a question, how do you visualize the financing mechanisms discussed working in an area which traditionally has a heavy tourism structure with established fees, et cetera, but which are not currently contributing to MPA management, but to other sectors? So it's sort of about how you shift to supporting an MPA if there's already an established tourism, but it's not necessarily supporting that MPA.
Yeah, no, really great questions. You know, one of the biggest challenges is making sure that the fees that are collected are used for conservation, and the you know, standard in this case is to try to make sure that those fees are retained at the local level, or at least at minimum at the protected area network level, and don't go straight to government treasury, where often they don't come back in a timely manner. Management's not incentivized by the tourist satisfaction, things like that. Where you have very strong tourism operations already, it's really important to, we found it's very important to document the economic value of that tourist industry, and in terms of jobs and in terms of revenue, and talking where places where hard currency is important. Documenting that and then using that information to build a commitment from politicians and from lawmakers that are responsible for budgets to make sure that that adequate budgets are allocated to conservation, and that laws and regulations are put in place to control harmful tourist activities. So I'm not sure if I covered both questions. What was the first question?
Well, they were both sort of getting at the same thing, as if you already have that tourist economy, and you already, but it's sort of transitioning to also supporting the MPAs.
Yeah.
Established MPAs.
Yeah, I mean, in many cases it depends on what the laws are, and within the laws, if there are, if entrance fees have to go to Treasury, for example, maybe there are ways to establish concessions where revenue can be retained locally, or other types of partnerships with the tourist associations. Often hotels have associations that promote their interests, and partnering with them can result in many cases you have these associations have established foundations that can contribute voluntarily, things like that. There are a lot of opportunities when you have tourism there, as long as you try to work with the stakeholders closely.
Okay, great. David, can you now flip back to the final slide for the forum, the Reef Resilience Network Forum? So I just wanted to let everyone know, thank you. Lots of people contributed to sort of the chat resources and contact information. And I would highly suggest that everybody move over to the Reef Resilience Network Forum to continue the discussions that have started in the chat, as well as answer the sort of be discussion of some new topics. But anyway, I'd encourage that. And thank you, everyone. David, this was a great presentation. Obviously, tons of interest and questions around it. We so appreciate you doing it, including David's doing it twice.
I want to thank everyone for listening as well. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, again, from us too, for coming today. And so I hope there's some thriving conversation on the Reef Resilience Network Forum after this. So thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.